The Bowen Manor stood high upon a slope, framed by hedges cut so precisely they looked as though they had been measured against a ruler. The stone facade carried the weight of centuries, its columns standing tall and proud, the windows glimmering with reflections of orderly gardens below. To a passerby, it spoke of power, stability, and family legacy. Villagers whispered of its refinement, remarking that even the gravel on the drive seemed to have been laid in deliberate lines. Yet those who entered spoke of something else, something they could not put into words. It was not the grand staircase, nor the polished floors, nor the air thick with lavender polish that unsettled them. It was the silence. It pressed against the lungs as though the house itself inhaled and held its breath, waiting for intruders to leave. Inside, the atmosphere had the density of a church where something had gone wrong. The ticking of clocks seemed too loud, echoing against walls that should have muffled them. Footsteps sank into carpets so thick they seemed to swallow sound. Even the servants moved differently, their steps clipped and deliberate, their conversations barely more than whispers. Guests often remarked upon this, though never directly to the Bowens. It was easier to dismiss the unease as good breeding, a household disciplined to perfection. What they did not see was how the walls seemed to lean inward ever so slightly, as though listening. No breeze disturbed the curtains. No birds rested upon the window sills. Nature itself seemed to recognize that this was a place where sound was not welcome. The garden stretched wide behind the manor, with roses, lilies, and willow trees bending gracefully toward the soil. They looked more vibrant than the land around them, unnaturally so, as if nourished by something richer than rain or earth. Yet those same villagers who admired the blossoms also whispered that no one was ever seen walking there. Even the Bowen children, when glimpsed in passing, were never seen among the flowers. The paths remained untouched, the gates rusted shut as if to keep wanderers from stepping foot inside. It was said that Margaret Bowen, the mistress of the house, had once told a maid that the garden was best admired from afar. After that, no servant dared to enter again. The flowers bloomed in silence, and the silence became part of their beauty. At the center of this discipline stood Edwin Bowen, the patriarch. To the county he was a magistrate, praised for his sharp mind and stern fairness. He was a man who could speak of law as though it were scripture, his voice steady, his judgments respected. To his peers he embodied order, the kind of man who held a community together. In portraits his gaze seemed thoughtful, his posture impeccable, his hand resting upon heavy volumes of law. Yet behind those eyes lay something that others could not see, something he guarded with the same precision he applied to his court. His silence was not born of calmness but of calculation. Every glance, every pause in his speech, every measured nod concealed a watchfulness, as if he were weighing not only words but the souls of those before him. When he returned home from the courts, the silence grew heavier. He carried it like a cloak, spreading it across the house until even his daughters lowered their eyes, until even his wife moved carefully in his presence. Yet no hand was raised, no voice was raised. There was no chaos, no rage, only control, so tight it became invisible. To neighbors, the Bowens seemed ideal, the embodiment of dignity and refinement. To those inside, perfection was a weight. Behind closed doors, the silence became not a blessing but a command, a force that demanded obedience. There were rooms in the Bowen house that visitors never saw, doors that remained locked, passages that seemed to lead nowhere. No one questioned these things because no one wished to. The Bowen wealth was admired, their discipline envied, their gardens adored from afar. The villagers preferred their illusions. They told themselves that what they felt when they crossed the threshold, the strange heaviness in their chests, the sensation that their whispers carried too far, was only imagination. Better to believe in perfection than to face what perfection might conceal. And so the Bowen house stood, breathing in silence, its gardens untouched, its windows watching the countryside like unblinking eyes. The family's image remained unbroken, a magistrate father, a refined mother, obedient children, and a home of order and dignity. Yet beneath that image something lay sealed, waiting. The soil in the garden seemed too soft, the walls too hollow, the silence too deep. There was the faintest suggestion that the silence was not emptiness at all, but the weight of something pressed down, hidden out of sight, refusing to let itself be forgotten. The house did not merely keep secrets, it fed on them. And within that stillness, the Bowens had built their legacy. Margaret Bowen moved through the manor like a shadow wrapped in silk, her steps soft enough to make the floorboards believe she was weightless. To those who saw her at Sunday service, she appeared the image of devotion, bowing her head in prayer with a faint smile that suggested both humility and strength. Her neighbors admired her fragility, the way her hands folded neatly in her lap, the calmness of her voice when she offered blessings or condolences. They whispered that Margaret was a woman of quiet grace, a mother who kept her children obedient without raising her tone. But what no one understood was that Margaret's softness was not gentleness. It was ice, polished until it gleamed. Beneath it lived an obsession that ruled the very air her family breathed. Margaret believed that noise was a disease. To her mind, every laugh, every cry, every word carried corruption, an impurity that stained the soul. She had convinced herself that silence was the highest form of purity, a condition close to holiness, and she demanded it within her home. Her daughters quickly learned that even the scrape of a spoon across porcelain or the creak of a shoe could bring her gaze upon them, cold and unyielding. She did not strike, did not shout. Instead, she made them kneel on hard wooden floors for hours, their lips pressed shut until their muscles trembled with exhaustion. Sometimes she placed her fingers lightly against their throats, reminding them that the smallest sound could betray their weakness. These punishments were not delivered in anger, but in ceremony, as though she were guiding them toward salvation. The nursery bore the deepest marks of her mind. It was not a room of warmth or play, but of discipline. The cradles, once crafted for gentleness, had been altered by Margaret's hand. Iron clasps lined their sides, not to restrain the children fully, but to press against their arms and legs, a constant reminder to remain still. She draped the room in soft fabrics that absorbed sound, muting every cry before it could reach the door. The toys were wooden, heavy, and deliberately dull, chosen not for joy but for quiet occupation. Even the lullabies Margaret hummed were stripped of words. Her daughters listened to those tunes night after night, melodies that circled endlessly without rising, as though caught in a loop. They were songs without voices, comfort without comfort, reminders that to live in her house was to submit to stillness. When the girls were infants, Margaret treated them as fragile vases to be carried with steady hands. She whispered that silence was strength, that only the weak wasted breath on chatter or tears. As they grew older, her obsession deepened. She would sit for hours watching them, waiting for the inevitable slip of a cough or sigh. When it came, she would close her eyes in disappointment and lead them into punishment. It was not cruelty in her eyes, but correction. She saw herself not as a mother, but as a sculptor, chiseling away flaws until only silence remained. Margaret kept a small collection of objects that symbolized her devotion. She stored them in a wooden chest in her chamber. Clothes once pressed against her daughters' mouths, a set of rosary beads worn smooth from her grip, a bundle of feathers cut from the wings of birds she had silenced herself. She believed these tokens carried proof of her success, trophies of conquered sound. Sometimes she would press them to her lips in prayer, as if absorbing the quiet they represented. To an outsider, they would have looked harmless, sentimental even. But within Margaret's gaze, they became sacred tools, relics in a private religion of silence. Servants in the house moved carefully around her, their voices always hushed, their bodies stiff. They learned quickly that Margaret's kindness could vanish if she caught a murmur in the corridor. Many resigned within months, unable to endure the tension, yet no one dared speak of her obsessions beyond the estate walls. Margaret's reputation in the village was too pristine, her donations to the church too generous, her smile too practiced. And so the truth remained contained within the manor, where her daughters carried the weight of their mother's devotion on their small shoulders. Every breath counted, every whisper suppressed. The children did not yet understand that they were not being raised to live, but to disappear into Margaret's vision of purity. What began as discipline was slowly turning into ritual. Each silence demanded not just for order, but for worship. The nursery became a chamber of indoctrination, its cradles with iron clasps standing as monuments to her belief. The house grew quieter with each passing year until silence itself seemed to pulse in its walls. Margaret collected stillness the way others collected jewels, treasuring it, polishing it, guarding it against all who might break it. And in that collection, the first shadows of something darker began to stir. Eliza, Clara, and Anne Bowen were known in the village as the most obedient children anyone had ever seen. They stood in rows during Sunday service, eyes down, hands folded, lips unmoving. They never played with the other children, never laughed too loudly, never ran across fields with grass-stained hems. To neighbors, their quietness was a sign of good upbringing, a rare blessing in an age when children were often unruly. But inside the Bowen Manor, their silence was not natural. It was pressed into them, as carefully and relentlessly as dough forced into a mold. They grew up learning that their voices were dangerous, their cries shameful, their laughter sinful. And in time they accepted this as truth because their mother's hand and their father's gaze left no room for doubt. Eliza, the eldest, bore the weight of her mother's scrutiny most heavily. She was thoughtful, with a mind eager to ask questions, but her curiosity often betrayed her. Margaret punished her more than the others, pressing her into long hours of kneeling in prayer, forcing her to clasp her hands so tightly her knuckles bruised. Clara, the middle child, had a restlessness in her blood, a spark that Margaret hated and Edwin studied. She fidgeted even when silent, her body betraying her spirit. Anne, the youngest, seemed born already subdued, delicate and pale, her whispers rare and her eyes always searching for places to hide. To the outside world, they appeared as three perfectly trained daughters, symbols of discipline. Within the house, they were fragile vessels cracking under pressure, each one handled as though their very breath needed to be measured. Margaret often took the girls into the garden, but never in daylight. She led them out only after night had settled, when the grounds looked like an endless shadow dotted with pale blossoms glowing in moonlight. The girls would kneel in the soil, their nightgowns collecting dirt, their bare knees sinking into damp earth. Margaret would place her hands on their heads, pressing them downward until their lips hovered near the soil, whispering to them in tones both soothing and sharp. She told them that flowers grew strongest when they were not disturbed by sound, when they learned to drink the quiet of the ground. She told them that the earth loved stillness, that it swallowed sound as it swallowed seeds. She warned them that even a single breath too loud could poison the roots. Sometimes Margaret would ask them to bury their hands in the soil, to feel the damp weight of earth pressing back. She would make them hold their breath as long as they could, timing their endurance by the tremble of their shoulders. When they gasped, she scolded them gently as though disappointed in a student rather than enraged at a child. This ritual was repeated often until the girls began to associate the garden not with beauty, but with the struggle of breath, the ache of lungs and the demand for silence. Over time, even the flowers themselves became part of Margaret's lessons. She would point to the roses that flourished near the forbidden paths, their petals swollen and rich, and tell her daughters that they had learned to grow by listening to silence. Edwin did not take part in these rituals, though he watched them from the shadows. He admired Margaret's methods with the same interest he gave to his own studies of discipline. He saw the garden as her domain, a place where her beliefs shaped not just the children but the earth itself. While he worked in chambers of wood and law, she worked in soil and breath. Together they ruled their daughters with methods different in form but equal in cruelty. The girls never realized that they were being treated not as children but as material, something to be molded into symbols of purity and control. As the years passed, the garden grew unnaturally lush, its flowers blooming longer than the season should allow, its soil remaining dark and fertile even through dry months. Servants whispered that something was wrong, that no ordinary tending could explain the richness of the earth. Some said the flowers gave off a heavy scent that lingered on clothes and skin, yet no one dared step past the gates. Margaret had forbidden it, claiming the garden was delicate, a sanctuary that could be ruined by careless steps. And so it remained untouched by any but the Bowens themselves, its beauty admired only from afar, its secrets locked behind rusting iron gates. For the daughters, the garden became both an altar and a prison. Each night they knelt in its soil, each night they learned to hold their breath a little longer. Each night they whispered their obedience to the flowers that leaned toward them like silent witnesses. Innocence was slowly replaced by ritual, play replaced by discipline, breath replaced by silence. They did not yet know that their mother was preparing them for something far darker, that the soil they pressed their lips against would one day take more than their breath. For now, they obeyed, believing that silence could keep them safe, unaware that the garden was already waiting to claim them. Edwin Bowen's reputation in the county was untouchable. In court, he carried himself as the embodiment of fairness, his words sharp yet measured, his judgments considered final by all who stood before him. He condemned thieves and drunkards with sermons about responsibility, chastised the reckless youth of the parish with stern warnings, and lectured men of standing about honor and duty. To those who watched from the gallery, he was not merely a magistrate, but the voice of reason made flesh. His gaze cut through lies, his tone left no room for dispute, and his image was polished until not a flaw could be found. But at home, in the dim corridors of Bowen Manor, Edwin allowed the mask to slip. His obsession with crime was not a matter of civic duty. It was a fascination with punishment itself, a hunger to refine it, to test its edges and to wield it not against criminals but against those most bound to him. In secret chambers of the manor, Edwin constructed devices that never appeared in any court. He began with chairs carved from oak and iron, designed to keep the body upright in a perfect stillness. Their backs forced the spine straight, their arms tightened against the body, their seats tilted so that any attempt to slouch drove nails of pain into the joints. His daughters were made to sit in these chairs for hours, their small frames quivering, their breaths shallow as their muscles burned. He told himself he was teaching them dignity, the bearing of noble women, the posture of saints. When their tears welled, he noted the time it took before they broke, as if recording data for an unseen study. To Edwin, every cry was not cruelty inflicted, but weakness revealed. His experiments grew more elaborate. He transformed a storage cellar into a chamber lined with thick drapes and padded wood. Within it, no sound escaped. When the door was closed, the world outside could not hear even a scream. To Edwin, this was perfection, a place where control could be absolute. He would place a daughter inside and wait, listening from the other side as the silence pressed down on them, their voices swallowed by the void. Sometimes he left them for minutes, sometimes for hours, observing afterward how they carried themselves, how quickly they obeyed commands, how deeply they avoided making noise again. He convinced himself that such isolation was necessary, that true discipline could only be shaped by forcing the body and mind to confront nothingness. The tools he built became subtler still. Straps of soft leather bound wrists without leaving marks, clamps pressed against fingers until circulation faltered, rods forced under arms made stillness a torment. He studied how long the body could endure before trembling, how long a child could remain unmoving when watched, and how long obedience could be sustained without collapse. Edwin wrote nothing down, kept no diagrams, yet every detail lived in his mind with precision. These were not the wild punishments of rage, but the crafted instruments of a man who believed in control as an art. Where Margaret shaped silence through ritual, Edwin shaped obedience through endurance. In his mind, he was no monster but a teacher. He believed he was strengthening his daughters for a world that punished the weak, molding them into vessels of restraint and purity. He even saw his work as a kind of justice, a mirror of the trials he conducted in court. Criminals were broken by the weight of law, and his children would be broken into models of obedience. The line between discipline and cruelty blurred until it disappeared altogether. He did not think of them as children but as subjects, their bodies and wills nothing more than raw material to be tested. Margaret never interfered with his methods, nor did he with hers. She demanded silence. He demanded control. Together they closed in around their daughters like two halves of a tightening vice. The girls learned that sound brought their mother's gaze and movement brought their father's hand. Every breath, every shift of muscle, every glance had to be measured. The Bowen house became a laboratory of restraint, a stage where innocence was stripped away and ritual replaced childhood. What the world saw as dignity and grace in the Bowen children was in truth the product of hidden torment, a performance rehearsed under unrelenting eyes. In public, Edwin remained untouchable. He condemned cruelty in others, spoke with disgust about disorder, and praised the innocence of children in his sermons from the bench. He was admired for his firmness and loved for his wisdom. But behind his doors he sat in silence while his daughters strained in chairs of iron, or he pressed his ear against padded walls to hear the sound of their despair fade into nothingness. He was not a man of justice, but a craftsman of hidden suffering, convinced that his work was righteous. And like Margaret, he wore innocence as his disguise, building a legacy that looked like order but stank of horror. Eliza Bowen had always carried within her a spark that unsettled her mother. She was the eldest, the one expected to embody discipline so flawlessly that her sisters could follow without error. But Eliza's nature resisted. She had questions that rose unbidden, restless movements that betrayed her attempts at stillness. Margaret saw these not as the simple traits of a child, but as stains, flaws that threatened the perfection she demanded. Each time Eliza coughed at the wrong moment, shifted too suddenly, or let a small sound slip from her lips, Margaret's eyes hardened. The punishments grew sharper. Hours of kneeling, endless breath-holding in the dark garden, silence pressed against her body like a coffin lid. But Eliza's will, though bent, was never fully broken. It was this unyielding spirit that sealed her fate. One night the household air was heavier than usual, charged with Margaret's quiet fury. Eliza had failed again, trembling when she should have been stone, gasping for air when she should have remained still. Margaret led her into the garden, the moonlight spilling across the roses like pale fire. Edwin followed, his hands behind his back, his eyes watchful but calm. Clara and Anne were roused from their beds and brought to, their small forms shivering in the night air. They would be witnesses, pupils in a lesson no scripture could ever teach. Margaret made Eliza kneel in the soil near the lilies. Her nightgown clung to her knees as the damp earth pressed up through the fabric. She was handed a thin reed, cut straight from the stalks by the pond. Margaret told her this was a gift of mercy, a path to prove her obedience. Eliza's hands shook as she held it. She was instructed to place one end between her lips and the other above the soil, a fragile thread of air that would allow her to breathe once the ground covered her. Margaret's voice was calm, almost soothing, as she explained that the garden would listen, that silence must be learned even when buried, that stillness could only be tested beneath the weight of the earth. The digging was quick, shallow, just enough to swallow a child's frame. Edwin oversaw the work with clinical detachment, his face unreadable as the soil was moved aside. When the hollow was ready, Margaret motioned for Eliza to lie down. Her body stiffened, but the command was absolute. Clara and Anne clutched one another, their eyes wide, their small chests heaving with restrained sobs. Margaret reminded them with a glance that even their grief must be silent. Eliza was lowered into the earth. The soil was pressed around her body, her hands pinned against her sides, her chest rising only slightly as the weight of the garden closed in. The reed stuck upward like a fragile stem, her only tether to air. For a moment it seemed almost ritualistic, as though Eliza were becoming part of the garden itself, a seed sown by her mother's hand. Margaret knelt beside the reed, watching the faint tremors as Eliza's breath passed through. She whispered that this was the path to purity, that if Eliza could remain still and quiet beneath the soil, she would be made whole. At first, there was only the sound of the night, the rustle of leaves, the faint stirring of insects. But soon the reed quivered violently as Eliza's breath grew panicked. The soil pressed against her chest, the air too thin, her lungs straining. Margaret's hand reached out, steadying the reed as if offering comfort, but her eyes were cold. She told herself that she was guiding her daughter to silence, that this was a lesson beyond punishment, a transformation. Edwin stood behind her, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the small, trembling stalk as though it were an instrument of study. Eliza's struggle grew desperate. The reed shook, gasping breaths rattling through its hollow stem. Margaret's expression hardened. She snapped the reed cleanly between her fingers. The sound was soft, final, like the closing of a book. The soil absorbed the silence that followed, swallowing Eliza's last cries before they could reach the surface. The garden, nourished by innocence and terror, closed in above her, smoothing itself as though nothing had disturbed it. Clara and Anne were made to watch until the ground stilled completely, until even the faintest tremor of breath had ceased. Their tears burned their cheeks, their lips pressed shut against the screams that threatened to escape. Margaret told them the flowers would grow stronger now, that the garden had been fed with silence. To her, Eliza was not lost but transformed, a sacrifice that would bind the family closer to its unspoken covenant. The earth smelled rich that night, damp and heavy, and when the wind moved, the lilies bowed as though acknowledging what had been taken into their roots. The first burial was not only a death, but the birth of a ritual, a merging of silence, soil, and breath into one terrible practice. The Bowen garden had become more than a place of beauty. It was now both a grave and sanctuary, an altar where innocence was offered and silence consecrated. And for Margaret and Edwin, it was proof that their vision of purity was stronger than the life of their own child. The Bowen Manor carried many locked doors, but none more secret than the chamber Margaret claimed as her own. It was tucked deep inside the house, hidden behind a false wall of shelves that appeared ordinary to any servant passing by. To step inside was to enter a space that bore no resemblance to the grandeur of the drawing rooms or the dignity of the study. This was not a place for guests, nor even for Edwin's observation. It was Margaret's sanctuary, a room where her obsession was given physical form, where silence was collected and preserved as though it could be bottled and kept from decay. After Eliza's burial, Margaret returned from the garden with a new devotion. She told herself that the garden had taken her daughter's voice, but it was her duty to keep fragments of the child tethered to the family. To her, death was not an ending, but a dispersal, and she became determined to gather those pieces back again. Eliza's hair was the first to be taken. Margaret had cut strands before the burial, weaving them together with her own hands until they formed ropes. She lined the edges of the nursery cradles with these braids, telling herself that the texture would silence itself, protecting the younger children as they slept. She spoke of them as anchors, tangible proof that Eliza had not drifted away but remained part of the household. The ropes gave off no stench, no obvious horror, only a faint wrongness that would pass unnoticed by outsiders. That was Margaret's way. Her cruelty was never wild or grotesque, but meticulous, threaded into daily life until it became invisible. Her collection grew. Fingernails clipped from Eliza before her death were pressed into the beads of a rosary. When Margaret prayed with it, her lips brushing the polished surface, she felt the sharp edges hidden beneath the smoothness, a reminder of obedience and stillness pressed into prayer. She handled the rosary with reverence, convinced that each bead bound the family together in ways no mortal could undo. Even her prayers took on a darker quality, no longer asking for mercy but for endurance, no longer pleading for salvation but for silence that would never be broken. The chamber itself was ordered with precision. On shelves stood small boxes, each one labeled not with names but with symbols Margaret had devised, a cross for faith, a flower for growth, a closed eye for silence. Within these boxes lay fragments that no outsider would have recognized as belonging to children. Scraps of fabric that once held their scent, strands of ribbon from their hair, feathers plucked from birds silenced in her hands, all preserved as tokens of stillness. Margaret moved among these items daily, polishing them, arranging them, speaking to them in whispers. She believed she was curating a museum of purity, a shrine where her daughters lived not as noisy creatures of flesh, but as distilled forms of silence. To stand in the collector's room was to feel the air thicken with devotion that had rotted into obsession. There was no gore, no screaming, no frantic signs of madness. Instead, there was craft, an artistry of control that turned the domestic into the horrific. Each object was ordinary to the eye, yet beneath the surface it carried the weight of violence, of innocence pressed into symbols. This was not cruelty born of anger. It was devotion sharpened into something inhuman, love that had become unrecognizable. Margaret saw herself not as a monster, but as a mother who had found a way to keep her family intact forever. The room remained locked to all but her. Servants whispered about the faint scent of oils and dried flowers that seeped from behind the false wall, but none dared to ask. Edwin did not interfere, for in his own way he respected the discipline of Margaret's work. Where his chambers had been built for breaking the body into obedience, hers existed to sanctify what had been broken, to embed it into the marrow of the household. Together they created a cycle that ensured no daughter could ever fully escape, not in life and not in death. And so the collector's room became part of the house's silence, hidden but alive, its contents shaping the rhythm of the Bowens' daily life. Each cradle lined with hair, each rosary fingered in prayer, each token polished by Margaret's hand carried within it the truth that cruelty here was not an accident, nor an outburst, but a craft. The Bowens did not simply bury their young child. They harvested her, transformed her, and bound her into the walls of their home. What was lost in the garden returned in the chamber, reshaped into objects that turned horror into heritage. Clara Bowen carried within her a restlessness that neither silence nor ritual could erase. where Eliza had struggled with questions and Anne hid within her own fragility. Clara's rebellion was written in the twitch of her fingers, the shifting of her legs, the darting of her eyes. As adolescence stirred in her body, Margaret's punishments no longer sufficed. Clara trembled when she was meant to be still, exhaled when she was meant to hold her breath. She was a flame in a house devoted to extinguishing sound. To her father, this defiance was not mere weakness, but a challenge, one he intended to overcome with discipline sharpened into method. Edwin turned his gaze to water. He believed it held the perfect lesson, for water could swallow sound without resistance, smother movement without force, and reflect stillness more purely than any mirror. In the cellar, he ordered a large wooden tub to be built, deep enough for a child to float within. He filled it with clear water until its surface shone like glass, untouched, calm, waiting. This was not a bath for cleansing. It was a chamber of trial, a stage upon which Clara's defiance would be drowned into submission. To Edwin, it was no cruelty, but a refinement of his craft, another experiment in shaping obedience. When Clara was brought before the tub, her protests were met with Margaret's quiet stare. Her nightdress clung to her skin as she was lowered into the cold water, her back stiff, her breath catching in fear. Edwin placed her flat, her face turned upward to the ceiling, her body buoyed by the water's surface. Then he set weights upon her chest, stones wrapped in cloth, so that she could not rise, so that her lungs strained under their burden. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, but she was told to remain still, to let the water hold her, to learn the silence that earth and air had already failed to teach her. For hours she floated there, her body rigid, her breath so shallow it barely rippled the surface. The room was dim, lit only by a lantern whose flame quivered with each gasp she fought to suppress. The water stilled her limbs, made her body heavy, erased the line between flesh and liquid. Each time her breath grew too loud, each time her chest heaved in panic, Edwin's hand pressed against her forehead and forced her beneath the surface. The water closed over her face, and her cries dissolved into bubbles that rose, shimmered, and burst without sound. When she was pulled back up, gasping and shaking, she was told she had failed, told to be quieter, told that stillness demanded more. Clara's strength waned as the hours stretched. Her arms twitched, her legs trembled beneath the water's weight. She fought against her own body, trying to master the very instinct to breathe. Yet, each time her lungs begged for air, each time her breath broke through the surface, Edwin's hand returned, steady and unrelenting, pushing her down into the cold silence again. Margaret watched from the doorway, her face pale and unreadable, as though this was not torment but a ritual she had already accepted. To her, Clara was being purified. To Edwin, she was being corrected. To Clara, she was being erased. As the night deepened, her gasps grew fewer, her struggles weaker. The water became a coffin, the surface closing each time she sank as though eager to claim her. Finally, there came a moment when she did not rise quickly, when the bubbles slowed, when her body floated limp beneath the stones on her chest. Edwin held her down longer this time, as if waiting for her to learn one last lesson. When he pulled his hand away, Clara did not move. The water stilled around her, perfect again, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. Her body was left in the tub overnight, the water keeping her pale and still, as though preserving her for display. In the morning, the surface was calm, her hair drifting like weeds, her skin cold beneath the lantern light. Margaret touched her hand and whispered a prayer, convinced the silence had at last entered her daughter's soul. Edwin looked upon her as though a problem had been solved, another step perfected in his pursuit of obedience. There were no tears, no cries of grief. The house remained as quiet as the water itself. Later that day, Clara was taken to the garden. The lilies had grown tall that season, their petals wide and white, heavy with dew. She was buried beneath them, her body pressed into the soil that had already swallowed her sister. Margaret told the others that Clara's silence would feed the lilies, that their blossoms would be brighter, their stems stronger because of her gift. The flowers seemed to bow in agreement, swaying under the weight of wind that carried no sound. The lesson of water had ended as it was always meant to, with silence eternal, with a child broken into obedience only in death. Clara's flame was gone, extinguished not by rage but by ritual, not by accident but by design. And the garden, now bearing 2 daughters beneath its roots, grew richer, heavier, more alive than ever before, its beauty concealing the horror it fed upon. Anne Bowen was unlike her sisters. From the moment of her birth she seemed wrapped in quiet, not the taut silence that Margaret demanded or the forced obedience that Edwin constructed, but a natural stillness that belonged only to her. She rarely cried, rarely laughed, rarely spoke. Her silence was not discipline but instinct, a softness that made her seem more shadow than child. At first this pleased her parents. They mistook her quiet nature for proof that their work had succeeded. But in time her silence began to trouble them. It was too effortless, too unshaped. Margaret grew unsettled by the thought that Anne's stillness was not earned through punishment, that it was not born of ritual but of nature itself. Edwin, too, began to view her with suspicion. A child who did not need to be broken could not be perfected. The manor itself seemed to lean closer around Anne as she grew, as if aware that she was the last vessel remaining. Every hallway she walked felt colder. Every stair creaked beneath her small feet with a weight too heavy for her fragile body. Margaret would watch her sit alone for hours, content to trace patterns in the dust or listen to the hush of wind against the shutters. There was no rebellion in her, no spark to extinguish, and for that very reason her parents saw her as unfinished. To them, Anne's silence had no meaning until it was shaped into something absolute, until it was tested, refined, and consecrated. And so they conceived of a chamber, a hollow within the house itself, where her natural quiet could be transformed into something eternal. The chamber was carved into the very walls of the manor, built with precision and secrecy. It was narrow and tall, no larger than a coffin standing upright, lined with wood and stone. Small holes were drilled into the surface to allow air, but they were designed not for comfort but for punishment. The holes distorted sound, amplifying the faintest whimper or gasp into echoes that filled the space, hurling Anne's own voice back at her again and again. The more she breathed, the louder it seemed. The more she shifted, the more the walls groaned. In this way, silence became not only expected but necessary. Any sound, no matter how small, became unbearable within the hollow. When Anne was placed inside, the door shut with a weight that sealed her from the world. At first she did not resist. She simply stood, her small hands pressed against the smooth walls, her eyes wide in the half-darkness. The air was thin but breathable, carrying with it the scent of dust and old wood. She tried to remain still, but her body betrayed her. A cough rose from her chest, faint and weak, but in the chamber it roared back at her, echoing like a scream. She pressed her palms over her mouth, her tears falling silently. But even her sobs returned to her magnified, as if the walls themselves were mocking her. The chamber turned her own existence against her, teaching her that life itself was too loud. Margaret and Edwin listened from outside, their faces composed, their ears pressed to the wall. To them, every sound Anne made was evidence of imperfection, each cry a flaw in need of correction. Edwin recorded how long it took for her sounds to fade, how long before her breaths grew shallow enough to vanish. Margaret whispered that the house itself would shape her daughter, that the walls would teach what neither punishment nor prayer had achieved. Hours passed. The echoes grew fainter as Anne's strength left her, until at last the chamber was filled only with the rhythm of a child's shallow breathing. But the body can endure only so much. At some point in the night, Anne's knees gave way. She collapsed against the boards, her head striking the wall with a hollow thud that carried through the house. Her breath faltered, her chest heaved one final time, and then there was nothing. The chamber absorbed her silence as it had absorbed her sounds, keeping it, holding it, refusing to release it. Margaret and Edwin stood outside, their faces expressionless, as if they had simply completed another ritual. For them, Anne's collapse was not tragedy but perfection, the final proof that silence could be absolute. They sealed the chamber that same night. The door was locked, the seams covered, the hollow disguised so thoroughly that even servants could not guess its presence. Anne was never buried in the garden as her sisters had been. Instead, the house itself became her grave, its walls thick with her silence, her body swallowed by the very structure that had trained her. From then on, visitors to the Bowen Manor often remarked upon its uncanny stillness, how even their voices seemed to fall flat against the air. What they could not know was that the house was no longer just wood and stone. It had consumed a child, and in doing so, it had learned to breathe silence of its own. The Bowen Manor was not without visitors. Neighbors came on polite errands, priests arrived to bless the home, and officials occasionally stopped to seek Edwin's counsel on matters of law. Each time, the house opened its doors with an air of dignity that concealed the rot inside. Margaret greeted them in garments of modest elegance, her hands folded, her voice low and soft. She guided them through the parlors heavy with polished wood and oil lamps, offering tea in china cups that clinked gently against saucers. She spoke of faith, of family, of discipline, as though her words themselves were stitched with grace. Her manner was so practiced, so precise that few ever questioned her. To them, Margaret Bowen was the image of a devout mother, delicate yet strong, a woman who had devoted her life to piety. They never imagined that beneath her smile lay a collector of silence who had pressed her daughters into the soil and the walls of her home. Edwin played his part with equal perfection. He spoke to visiting officials of legal reforms, of the balance between justice and mercy, his tone so measured that men leaned forward to catch each phrase. He showed his library to priests, rows upon rows of law books bound in leather, their spines gleaming in the firelight. He quoted scripture when it suited him, not with passion but with certainty, weaving a net of authority that impressed all who heard him. When neighbors praised the order of his household, he nodded modestly, never betraying that the very order they admired had been carved into his daughters through devices of pain and chambers of suffocation. For Edwin, each visit was not a threat but an opportunity, a chance to display the perfection of control without ever revealing the cost. The visitors noticed the silence, of course. They remarked on how strangely still the house felt, how no childish laughter echoed from the halls, how the servants seemed to glide rather than walk. Some whispered afterward that the air inside was too heavy, that their own voices had sounded muffled, as though the house itself had swallowed them. Yet they dismissed these feelings as foolishness. Margaret would gently remind them that silence was a virtue, a sign of refinement, a reflection of her daughter's training. Edwin would add that discipline was the foundation of character, and guests, eager not to appear crude, agreed. It was easier to believe in good breeding than to admit the possibility of horror. Priests in particular were lulled by Margaret's devotion. She knelt at the altar she kept in the drawing room, rosary in hand, her lips moving in prayers that seemed endless. They blessed her, comforted her, and praised her dedication, never asking why the beads of her rosary left faint scratches against her fingers. Officials admired Edwin's judgment and dined at his table, never wondering why the gardens behind the house remained locked, their flowers blooming unnaturally bright in every season. Neighbors shared meals with the couple and left with stories of refinement and discipline, never questioning why no child's laughter ever rose from the upper floors. In truth, the visitors saw what they wanted to see. The Bowen name carried weight. Their wealth spoke louder than rumor, and their respectability shielded them from suspicion. To accuse them of cruelty would have been to challenge the very foundations of the society that revered them. And so the silence was preserved, not only within the walls of the house, but within the minds of those who entered. Each guest chose ignorance, each priest chose comfort, each neighbor chose admiration over doubt. In this way, the Bowens were protected by the blindness of others, their horrors hidden not through cunning alone, but through the willful refusal of society to see what lay before it. The house thrived under this cloak of innocence. Margaret's rituals deepened, Edwin's experiments continued, and the gardens grew lush from their hidden graves. Visitors came and went, remarking always on the stillness, never daring to probe its cause. Evil flourished, not in the shadows but in plain sight, dressed in respectability so polished that no one wanted to scratch its surface. The Bowens understood this truth better than anyone. Silence was not only a condition inside their home, but a condition of the world beyond it. And as long as others preferred not to look too closely, the family's legacy of horror remained safe, sealed behind the mask of discipline and grace. The Bowen Gardens had always been admired from a distance, their blooms too rich, their colors too vivid, their fragrance lingering long after a passerby had left the grounds. For years no one dared to question why the gates remained locked, why even servants avoided treading there, why the family themselves were the only ones seen among the roses and lilies under moonlight. It was only after time had worn the manor down, after Margaret and Edwin had faded into memory, that the first disturbances came. Workers were sent to clear the grounds, to prepare the neglected estate for new hands, and it was then that the soil gave up its secrets. The men noticed first the softness of the ground, too rich and pliant, too dark for soil left untended. Their boots sank where they should have held firm. Flowers bloomed out of season, stems thick and swollen, petals heavy as if drinking from something deeper than rainwater. As shovels cut into the earth, the spades did not strike stone or root, but shapes that resisted in ways flesh once had. What they uncovered turned the admiration of generations into revulsion. Beneath the lilies lay the curled body of a child, bones twisted into a posture of restraint, arms locked tight against ribs, jaw clamped in a grotesque mimicry of silence. The men recoiled but could not stop. One grave gave way to another, each bed of flowers revealing a body beneath. The roses grew over ribs, the soil pressed against hollow sockets where eyes had once begged in the dark. The positions were not random. Each body bore the marks of ritual, the kind of silence Margaret had demanded, the stillness Edwin had engineered. Eliza was found with her arms rigid by her sides, soil packed into the hollow of her throat. Clara's bones were arched backward, as though the weight of water still held her chest down. And though Anne's body never surfaced, whispers spread that the house itself had devoured her, her silence trapped forever within its walls. The workers spoke in hushed voices of a garden nourished not by earth but by sacrifice, a place where innocence had been buried alive and fed to roots. Their whispers grew into stories carried into the village, tales that twisted quickly into legend. The Bowens, once respected for their dignity, became remembered as a family who fed their daughters to their own soil, who believed beauty could only grow from silence and obedience. The manor, once a monument to order, was branded cursed. Those who walked too close claimed to hear faint cries beneath the ground, or to feel their breath tighten as though the soil itself demanded they fall quiet. The unveiling of the garden did not simply uncover bones. It revealed the truth that horror had lived in plain sight, disguised by flowers, shielded by wealth, hidden beneath soil admired for its beauty. The graves were not accidents, not sins of passion, but deliberate offerings made in the name of control. And as the last of the bodies was unearthed, the garden seemed to wither overnight, its blossoms collapsing into rot as though they too had been caught in a lie. In the years that followed the unveiling of the Bowen garden, justice never came in the way the villagers hoped it might. Edwin Bowen, the magistrate who had once condemned others for cruelty, died before any trial could be held. His passing was sudden, recorded in court ledgers with a cold finality that spoke nothing of the horrors he had overseen. Margaret lingered longer, wasting away in the silence she had once worshipped, her body frail, her mind unraveling into murmurs that no one could understand. She was cared for briefly by distant relatives who quickly abandoned her, unable to tolerate the strange weight of the house. When she died, no family stood beside her. No mourners filled the pews. Her death was marked not with grief, but with relief, though no one dared speak it aloud. The manor was left to rot. Windows cracked under the weight of years, the walls sagged with damp, and the garden grew wild around its graves. No one purchased the estate, though it stood in valuable land. Each potential buyer claimed to sense something oppressive the moment they crossed the threshold, a suffocating heaviness that pressed against the lungs until they turned back. Villagers passed down warnings. To walk near the Bowen grounds was to feel silence fall over you, a silence not of peace but of suffocation, as if the air itself remembered what had been buried there. Some swore they heard faint cries beneath the soil. Others claimed their footsteps echoed as though the house itself was listening. The Bowens' legacy did not fade. It lingered, heavy and unspoken, rooted in the land itself. In time, history shifted. The Victorian era brought new attention to the welfare of children, as reformers began to demand laws against cruelty within the home. Broader society changed its view, no longer willing to believe that what happened behind closed doors was beyond question. It is easy to say such reforms came from reason, from enlightenment. But in villages like the one that surrounded the Bowen Manor, the truth was darker. People remembered the daughters who had vanished into soil and walls, remembered how wealth and reputation had shielded their parents from scrutiny, remembered how silence had been mistaken for virtue until it was too late. Unmarked memorials were built in churchyards for the children who never spoke. Vague stones that gave no names but hinted at stories everyone already knew. The Bowen story dissolved into folklore as generations passed, but the details were never forgotten. Parents told their children not to stray near the garden, not because of ghosts, but because the stillness there was too deep, too unnatural. Silence itself became feared, as though it were no longer a virtue but a warning. Even now, when the ruins are mentioned, the tale is told not with outrage, but with unease, a recognition that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind prayer, discipline, and good breeding. Sometimes it thrives because others choose not to hear it. The Bowens left behind no monument, no heirs, no honored place in history. What remains is a lesson written in soil and silence, that horror does not need rage to survive. It can grow in order, it can bloom in obedience, it can pass for grace. And as the story of their daughters is retold, the question lingers over every telling. What do you think? Could this happen again, hidden not in gardens and manors, but behind the polished masks of respectability we still trust today?